In the heart of Montana's Glacier County, where the Rocky Mountains cast long shadows across endless prairies, lived a man whose name would soon echo through local legends. Samuel Morrison had spent 43 years working the same stretch of land his grandfather had claimed in 1912, raising cattle and horses on a ranch that sprawled across 3,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving terrain in America. But beauty, as Samuel had learned, could mask the deadliest of secrets. The morning of September 15th started like any other, with Samuel walking out to check on his prized stallions in the eastern pasture. What he found there would change everything he thought he knew about the land he called home. The body of Thunder, his 12-year-old Appaloosa, lay twisted and broken near the creek bed. Massive claw marks raked across its flank and throat torn open with surgical precision. This wasn't the work of wolves or bears. This was something else entirely. Samuel knelt beside Thunder's still form, his weathered hands trembling as he traced the 4 parallel gashes that ran from shoulder to belly. In 30 years of ranching, he'd seen plenty of predator kills, but never anything like this. The precision was almost artistic, the violence calculated rather than frenzied. As he stood, something caught his eye in the soft mud near the water's edge, a paw print, larger than any mountain lion track he'd ever seen, with claw marks extending nearly 2 inches beyond the pad. Samuel Morrison was staring at evidence of a jaguar, an animal that supposedly hadn't roamed these parts for over a century, but the evidence was undeniable, pressed deep into the Montana soil like a signature of death. That evening, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and a phone book, calling every wildlife expert, game warden, and veterinarian within 100 miles. The responses were all the same: dismissive skepticism, followed by reluctant agreement to look at the evidence. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes from the Montana Wildlife Research Unit arrived 2 days later. Her small team equipped with cameras and casting materials, she spent 3 hours examining Thunder's remains and the surrounding area, taking measurements and photographs with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen too much death in her career. When she finally stood and removed her latex gloves, her face was pale beneath her field hat. Samuel had been right. The attack pattern, the size of the wounds, and most convincingly, the paw prints they'd found, all pointed to a jaguar. Not just any jaguar, but a massive male, possibly weighing over 200 pounds. Dr. Hayes explained that while jaguars had historically roamed as far north as the Grand Canyon, there hadn't been a confirmed sighting in Montana since the early 1900s. Climate change and shifting prey patterns might have driven this cat north from Mexico, but that was just speculation. What mattered now was that they were dealing with an apex predator that had developed a taste for horse meat and had the intelligence to avoid human contact while hunting. Samuel listened to her explanation with growing frustration. The wildlife officials wanted to set up camera traps and conduct a months-long study. They talked about tranquilizer guns and relocation programs, bureaucratic processes that could take half a year to implement. Meanwhile, Samuel had 47 horses scattered across his property, and fall was coming. The jaguar wouldn't wait for government approval to hunt again. As Dr. Hayes and her team packed their equipment, she turned to Samuel with a warning that would haunt him in the days to come. She told him that jaguars were different from other big cats, more intelligent and adaptable. They were known to change their hunting patterns based on human activity, becoming almost ghost-like in their ability to avoid detection. If this cat had indeed traveled hundreds of miles to reach Montana, it wasn't just desperate, it was exceptional. Samuel watched the government vehicles disappear down his dirt road, leaving him alone with a problem that felt too big for one man to handle. But Samuel Morrison hadn't built his ranch by waiting for other people to solve his problems. 3 days after Dr. Hayes left, Samuel found his second horse. Buttercup, a gentle mare he'd raised from a foal, lay in the north pasture with the same precise wounds as Thunder. This time, however, the jaguar had made a mistake. It had fed on the carcass, leaving behind traces of saliva that Samuel carefully collected in a glass jar. More importantly, the cat had left a clear trail of tracks leading toward the dense forest that bordered his property. Samuel spent that night cleaning his grandfather's Winchester Model 70, a rifle that had taken deer, elk, and black bear across 6 decades of Montana hunting seasons. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the responsibility of what he was about to do. Hunting a jaguar alone was dangerous enough, but hunting one that had proven itself capable of systematic predation was borderline suicidal. Yet Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about protecting his horses anymore. Something about the precision of the kills, the calculated nature of the attacks, felt personal. The next morning, Samuel loaded his truck with supplies and drove to the edge of the forest where the tracks disappeared into thick undergrowth. He'd grown up hunting these woods with his father and grandfather, learning to read sign and follow game trails through terrain that could break a man's ankle or hide him from searchers for weeks. If the jaguar wanted to play hide and seek in Samuel's backyard, the cat was about to learn that it had chosen the wrong opponent. Samuel parked his truck and began following the trail on foot. his rifle slung across his shoulder, and a GPS device clipped to his belt. The tracks were easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the soft earth that led deeper into the forest with purposeful direction. But after 2 hours of steady climbing, the trail began to change. The paw prints became sporadic, sometimes disappearing entirely for stretches of rocky ground before reappearing yards away in seemingly random directions. It was as if the jaguar knew it was being followed and was actively trying to confuse its pursuer. As the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, Samuel realized he was no longer following a simple trail. The jaguar was leading him somewhere specific, doubling back and circling in patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond normal animal behavior. When Samuel finally stopped to rest beside a fallen log, he made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath a pile of carefully arranged branches and leaves was the skeleton of another horse, one that had been missing for over 6 months. Samuel had assumed that Storm, his prize cutting horse, had simply wandered off and fallen into a ravine somewhere on the vast property. Now he understood the truth. The jaguar hadn't arrived recently. It had been hunting his horses for months, possibly even longer, taking them one at a time and hiding the evidence with an intelligence that bordered on human. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications. This wasn't a desperate predator driven north by hunger. This was a calculating killer that had been studying him and his operation for months, learning his routines and identifying his most valuable animals. The jaguar hadn't made any mistakes. It had simply decided it was time to accelerate its hunting schedule. As evening approached, Samuel found himself deeper in the forest than he'd ever ventured alone. The GPS showed he was nearly 10 miles from his truck, following a trail that seemed to wind endlessly through dense timber and rocky outcroppings. Just as he was considering turning back, he heard something that stopped him cold. The sound of a horse screaming in terror echoed through the trees ahead, followed by the unmistakable roar of a big cat. Samuel ran toward the sound. Crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with reckless abandon, he burst into a small clearing just in time to see the jaguar, a massive golden shadow, dragging something into the trees on the far side. But it wasn't a horse the jaguar was dragging. There was a man. Samuel raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots in the direction of the retreating cat. But the thick forest swallowed the animal and its victim before he could get a clear shot. Heart pounding, Samuel approached the center of the clearing, where he found signs of a struggle and drops of blood leading into the forest. But he also found something else that made his blood run cold. A backpack lying open on the ground, its contents scattered across the clearing. Among the items were research notes, photographs of paw prints, and a name tag identifying the owner. As Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the wildlife researcher, had returned to study the jaguar alone, and now she was paying the ultimate price for underestimating the intelligence of their quarry. Samuel checked his GPS and realized he was nearly 15 miles from the nearest road, in terrain so dense that even helicopter rescue would be nearly impossible. If Dr. Hayes was still alive, he was her only hope. But tracking a jaguar through dense forest at night was a death sentence for anyone, even someone with Samuel's experience. As darkness fell around him, Samuel faced an impossible choice: abandon the search and save himself, or continue pursuing a predator that had already proven itself smarter and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Samuel made his decision and continued deeper into the forest, using his flashlight sparingly to avoid alerting the jaguar to his presence. The blood trail was easier to follow than he'd expected, dark drops on leaves and bark that reflected his light like rubies in the darkness. After an hour of careful tracking, Samuel heard something that gave him hope. The sound of a human voice, weak but definitely alive, calling for help somewhere ahead. He moved toward the voice, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches or rustling leaves. The sound led him to a rocky outcropping where he found Dr. Hayes, badly injured but conscious, wedged between 2 large boulders. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and deep gashes across her shoulder were still bleeding freely. But she was alive, and more importantly, she was able to speak. Dr. Hayes grabbed Samuel's arm with surprising strength when he knelt beside her. Her eyes were wide with fear and something else shock at what she'd discovered. She told Samuel, in a whispered rush, that the jaguar hadn't attacked her randomly. It had been waiting for her, as if it knew she would return. More disturbing still, the cat had dragged her to this specific location, positioning her between the rocks in a way that suggested it was saving her for later. Dr. Hayes had been studying big cats for 15 years, and she'd never seen behavior like this. The jaguar was displaying problem-solving abilities and forward planning that bordered on the supernatural. As Samuel worked to stop her bleeding and stabilize her injuries, Dr. Hayes continued her urgent whisper. She'd found something during her unauthorized return trip, evidence that the jaguar wasn't alone. There were at least 3 cats working together, possibly more, displaying pack behavior that went against everything science knew about solitary jaguars. They'd established a territory that encompassed not just Samuel's ranch, but several neighboring properties, and they were eliminating large prey animals in a pattern that suggested long-term planning. The implications were terrifying. If Dr. Hayes was right, they weren't dealing with a single displaced predator, but with an entire family group of jaguars that had somehow migrated north and established themselves in Montana. Samuel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he processed this information. The jaguar that had been hunting his horses wasn't acting alone. It was part of a coordinated effort to establish a new territory, and humans had just become part of the food chain. A low growl from somewhere in the darkness above confirmed Samuel's worst fears. The jaguar had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. Samuel could hear movement in the rocks above them, the soft scraping of claws on stone that indicated at least two large cats positioning themselves for an attack. He helped Dr. Hayes wedge herself deeper between the boulders, then raised his rifle toward the sounds above. The Winchester held 5 rounds, and Samuel was an excellent shot. But in the darkness against multiple targets, his chances weren't good. The first jaguar appeared as a golden shadow against the stars, moving along the rocky ledge above with impossible grace. Samuel tracked it with his rifle barrel, waiting for a clear shot. When the cat paused to look down at them, Samuel fired. The .3006 round echoed through the forest like thunder, and the jaguar disappeared from the ledge. But Samuel's satisfaction was short-lived. The sound of his rifle had revealed their position, and now he could hear movement from 3 different directions. The jaguars were surrounding them, using tactics that seemed almost military in their precision. Dr. Hayes grabbed Samuel's ankle and pulled him down beside her. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told him something that changed everything. During her research, she'd discovered that the jaguars weren't just hunting livestock. They'd been studying human behavior, learning routines and patterns with an intelligence that suggested they were preparing for something bigger. The attacks on Samuel's horses weren't random predation, they were reconnaissance. The jaguars had been testing human response times, learning how long it took for help to arrive and how people reacted to evidence of their presence. Samuel felt his worldview crumble as Dr. Hayes continued her explanation. The jaguars had somehow learned to avoid camera traps, to hunt when humans were least likely to interfere, and to hide evidence of their kills with methodical precision. They weren't just adapting to human presence, they were actively studying it, preparing for a coordinated assault on human settlements. The sound of movement in the darkness around them grew closer, and Samuel realized they were about to become the jaguars' final test subjects. Samuel made a decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of waiting for the jaguars to attack, he began making as much noise as possible, shouting and banging his rifle against the rocks while helping Dr. Hayes do the same with loose stones. The cacophony echoed through the forest, and after several minutes, the sounds of movement around them began to fade. The jaguars, for all their intelligence, were still wild animals with an instinctive fear of loud, unexpected noises. Samuel's gamble had worked, at least temporarily. As dawn broke over the Montana wilderness, Samuel was able to get a better look at their surroundings and plan their escape. Dr. Hayes' injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and Samuel's GPS showed they were only 3 miles from a logging road that could accommodate a rescue vehicle. The problem was crossing 3 miles of jaguar territory while carrying an injured person. Samuel used his cell phone to call for emergency medical help, providing GPS coordinates and a brief explanation of their situation. The dispatcher seemed skeptical about the jaguar claims, but agreed to send a helicopter to the logging road. Samuel had 4 hours to get Dr. Hayes to the pickup point, through terrain that was now confirmed to contain multiple large predators. The journey became a nightmare of careful movement and constant vigilance. Samuel fashioned a crude travois from branches in his jacket, allowing him to drag Dr. Hayes while keeping his rifle ready. Every shadow could hide a jaguar, every sound might signal an attack. But the cats seemed to have retreated deeper into the forest, perhaps regrouping after their failed night assault. It took Samuel nearly 5 hours to reach the logging road, arriving just as the medical helicopter was preparing to leave. Dr. Hayes was airlifted to the regional hospital, where she would make a full recovery. But her research notes and Samuel's testimony would launch an investigation that would reveal the true scope of the jaguar problem in Montana. Over the following weeks, wildlife officials confirmed the presence of at least 4 adult jaguars in the Glacier County area. Along with evidence of successful breeding, the cats had established a territory covering over 200 square miles, and they had indeed been systematically studying human behavior patterns. Trail cameras finally captured images of the jaguars, revealing animals that were larger and more robust than their southern cousins, apparently thriving in the Montana environment. Samuel Morrison became something of a local celebrity, the rancher, who had tracked jaguars through the wilderness and lived to tell about it. But he took no satisfaction in the attention. His horses were still dead, his ranch was still in the middle of jaguar territory, and the experts still had no real solution to the problem. The jaguars had proven themselves too intelligent for conventional wildlife management techniques, and too dangerous to ignore. The story might have ended there, with government agencies taking over the jaguar problem and Samuel returning to his normal ranching routine. But 3 months after the rescue, Samuel discovered something that suggested the jaguar's intelligence went beyond anything Dr. Hayes had theorized. While checking fence line in his south pasture, Samuel found a neat pile of horse bones arranged in a perfect circle, with a freshly killed deer placed in the center like an offering. The arrangement was too precise to be natural, too symbolic to be coincidental. The jaguars weren't just intelligent, they were trying to communicate. Samuel stared at the bone circle for a long time, trying to understand what the jaguars might be trying to tell him. Was it a warning, a peace offering, or something else entirely? As he stood there in the Montana sun, surrounded by the vast wilderness that had shaped his family for 3 generations, Samuel Morrison realized that his war with the jaguars was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning. The bone circle suggested that the jaguars saw humans not as prey, but as competitors for territory. They were attempting to establish dominance through displays that mimicked human symbolic behavior, indicating a level of cultural learning that shouldn't have been possible in wild animals. Samuel photographed the arrangement and called Dr. Hayes, who had returned to her research position despite her injuries. Her excitement was palpable, even over the phone. The bone circle represented the first documented case of jaguars attempting symbolic communication with humans, a behavior that would revolutionize understanding of big cat intelligence. But for Samuel, the implications were more personal and immediate. The jaguars weren't going anywhere, and they were getting smarter. Samuel Morrison walked back to his truck that afternoon, knowing that his quiet life as a Montana rancher had changed forever. The jaguars had chosen his land as their territory's center, and they were making it clear that they intended to stay. The question now wasn't whether Samuel could coexist with the most intelligent predators North America had seen in centuries, but whether humanity was prepared for what that coexistence might look like. As he drove away from the bone circle, Samuel caught a glimpse of golden fur in his rearview mirror. One of the jaguars was watching him leave, its yellow eyes reflecting the afternoon sun like twin flames. Samuel nodded to the cat in acknowledgement, a rancher's greeting to a worthy adversary. The hunt was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. As winter settled over Glacier County, Samuel Morrison found himself living a life he never could have imagined. The bone circle had been just the beginning of what wildlife experts were now calling the most significant predator-human interaction study in North American history. Dr. Hayes had returned with a full research team, establishing a permanent monitoring station on Samuel's property with his reluctant permission. The arrangement was unprecedented, a working ranch serving as ground zero for studying apex predators that had rewritten the rules of animal behavior. Samuel had become an unwilling participant in scientific history, his daily routines now documented and analyzed as part of understanding how humans and superintelligent jaguars might coexist. The financial compensation from the Wildlife Service helped offset his livestock losses, but money couldn't replace the fundamental change in how Samuel viewed his own land. Every morning when he stepped outside, he was acutely aware that he was being watched, studied, and evaluated by predators whose intelligence seemed to grow with each passing day. The jaguars had learned to avoid the research cameras most of the time, but they made sure Samuel knew they were still there. Fresh tracks appeared regularly near his house, always in places where he would notice them, as if the cats were maintaining a dialogue through signs and symbols only he could read. Dr. Hayes' research had revealed disturbing patterns in the jaguars, behavior that went far beyond simple territorial establishment. The cats were teaching each other human-specific hunting techniques, passing knowledge through their group that suggested cultural learning previously thought impossible in solitary predators. They had learned to distinguish between armed and unarmed humans, to recognize the sound of different vehicles, and to time their movements based on human activity patterns with precision that bordered on the supernatural. More troubling still, satellite tracking data indicated that other jaguar groups were moving north from Mexico and Central America, possibly drawn by some form of communication from the Montana cats. Samuel often found himself standing at his kitchen window in the early morning hours, coffee mug in hand, watching the tree line for movement that might indicate his unusual neighbors were active. The jaguars had cost him 12 horses over the course of a year, but they had also brought him a strange kind of fame that attracted visitors from around the world. Wildlife photographers, researchers, and journalists regularly requested permission to stay on his property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Montana jaguars. Samuel accommodated most of these requests, partly for the income they provided, but mostly because he had developed a protective feeling toward the cats that surprised even him. The turning point came on a February morning when Samuel discovered that the jaguars had left him another message, this one more complex than the bone circle. Arranged in his front yard was an intricate pattern made from stones, branches, and what appeared to be deliberately placed animal bones. Dr. Hayes and her team spent hours documenting and analyzing the arrangement, eventually determining that it resembled astronomical patterns found in ancient Mayan jaguar temples. The implications were staggering. The jaguars weren't just intelligent, they were accessing genetic memories that connected them to their species' deep cultural history. With human civilizations. Samuel watched the scientists measure and photograph the pattern, feeling a strange mixture of pride and unease. His ranch had become the site of interspecies communication that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and intelligence. The jaguars had chosen him, specifically, as their point of contact with the human world, and that responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had become more than a rancher. He was now a translator between two species that were learning to understand each other in ways that science was struggling to explain. As spring arrived and the research team prepared to expand their study, Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He announced that he would be converting a portion of his ranch into a permanent wildlife sanctuary, specifically designed to accommodate the jaguars while allowing continued research into their remarkable intelligence. The decision would cost him most of his traditional ranching income, but Samuel had come to understand that he was part of something much larger than cattle and horses. He was witnessing the emergence of a new kind of relationship between humans and predators, one that could reshape how people understood their place in the natural world. The sanctuary designation brought new challenges and responsibilities. Samuel found himself working with federal wildlife agencies, international researchers, and conservation organizations to establish protocols for managing superintelligent predators in proximity to human populations. The Montana jaguars had become a test case for coexistence scenarios that might soon be necessary in other parts of North America. As climate change continued to alter predator distribution patterns, Samuel's ranch was no longer just his home. It had become a laboratory for the future of human-wildlife interaction. Dr. Hayes often told Samuel that his decision to hunt the jaguar alone had ironically led to the most important conservation breakthrough of the 21st century. By refusing to wait for bureaucratic solutions and confronting the problem directly, Samuel had forced a confrontation that revealed the true nature of what they were dealing with. The jaguars had responded to his boldness with their own form of respect, recognizing him as an alpha figure worthy of communication rather than simply another prey species to be managed. On quiet evenings, Samuel would walk the perimeter of his property, following trails that had been worn smooth by both human researchers and jaguar paws. The cats still watched him from the shadows, but now their presence felt less threatening and more collaborative. They had reached an understanding based on mutual respect rather than dominance, with Samuel serving as the bridge between two intelligent species learning to share the same territory. The lonely farmer who had once grabbed his shotgun in frustrated anger had become something unprecedented, a human ambassador to the most intelligent predators his continent had ever known. The story of Samuel Morrison and the Montana jaguars would be told for generations, not as a tale of man versus nature, but as the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between humans and the wild world around them. Samuel had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from discovering that they were never really enemies at all. In the vast wilderness of Montana, under skies that had witnessed countless conflicts between predators and prey, a new kind of peace had been negotiated through courage, respect, and the willingness to see intelligence wherever it might emerge. As Samuel looked out over his transformed ranch, now bustling with researchers and protected jaguars, he reflected on how a simple desire to protect his horses had led him into the pages of scientific history. The lonely farmer was lonely no more, surrounded by colleagues, visitors, and the most remarkable neighbors any rancher had ever had. His grandfather's land would continue in the Morrison family, but now it served a purpose that transcended any single family's legacy. It had become proof that humans and predators could coexist when both species approached each other with intelligence, respect, and the courage to step beyond the boundaries of what had always been considered possible.